No one in their right mind would bet against Bandalam.
Bandalam. Bandalam. Bandalam. Bandalam.
Bandalam, Bandalam.
We're in the murder basement, been hearing some weird noises, so we're just going to go check that out under the hat. It's been a while since we've been down here. There's all sorts of spiders, but they don't really make the kind of noises we've been hearing, so, wait, what the fuck is that? One sec. What is that? Oh, God.
If you're gonna give me the first blow, then I'll gladly take it.
Hello everyone. James Stephanie Sterling here in the murder basement, where something happened, but let's not talk about that. We're talking about role-playing games today, RPGs. And before we get into the meat of the matter, it actually got me thinking about a little thing. When it comes to a game like Final Fantasy, is RPG even technically right? Because with a, say, Dungeons and Dragons style RPG, you pick your own class, make your own character, and you, as the player, fulfill that role. Whereas you play something like Final Fantasy VII, and you're Cloud Strife, and he's making all the decisions, and you're following along his story, his dialogue. You've got influence over the battles, and exactly how fast he gets to a location, but are you playing a role? Or is the role playing you? Pretentious.
Get in the car, dickheads. The discourse has come to town and it's time to run our fucking mouths. This past week, Final Fantasy XVI producer Naoki Yoshida, in an interview with SkillUp, sparked quite the interesting debate over the term JRPG and gave us all a lot to think about when it comes to perspective and how what may seem innocuous to one group might carry much more negativity for another. JRPG, aka Japanese role-playing game. Most of us have used it as a shorthand before, and most of us have considered it quite harmless. But I wonder now, how many of us who've casually used the term for years stop to consider what Japanese RPG means to, like, Japanese game developers? Well, this is what Yoshida got everybody thinking about, and it turns out that they're not exactly in love with the term. This is going to depend on who you ask, but there was a time when this term first appeared 15 years ago, and for us as developers, the first time we heard it, it was like a discriminatory term. Yoshida explained by way of translator Koji Fox, as though we were being made fun of for creating these games, and so for some developers, the term JRPG can be something that will maybe trigger bad feelings because of what it was in the past. In hindsight, oh that blessed beast hindsight, it makes sense really, and it's the least insulting. JRPG could very easily be seen as reductive at best. I'll admit I never really thought about it myself, and that ignorance is on me, especially because I was starting to make my name in games media at the time of there being a lot of anti-JRPG sentiment. But in my head, it's just a term people used, so I used it. That's kinda how terminology works, but I think we've all learned over the years that just because a term is considered okay, it doesn't mean it is. As time goes by, the understanding of how words affect certain groups of people, or the re-examination of the etymology behind them, can alter our perception of them and either change or outright retire their use. This is why I no longer use the term jizz peddler anymore. Stickle shits, I said it. Jizz peddler, I said stickle shits. Oh, jizz!
Busy, busy, busy,
It wasn't a compliment to a lot of developers in Japan, Yoshida expounded. We understand that recently JRPG has better connotations and it's being used as a positive, but we still remember the time when it was used as a negative. What's personally interesting to me is how this discussion of the origin of the term lines up with and informs a bugbear of mine that I've recently been ranting about on live streams while playing Final Fantasy games as a result of my worrying theatre rhythm obsession. See, like I intimated a moment ago, I remember when what we've classically thought of as traditional JRPGs was something of a pariah in Western gaming discourse, particularly when it came to game reviews. There's a particular video game I always bring up when it comes to this subject: Lost Odyssey. Mistwalker's Xbox exclusive RPG has always been, in my opinion, brilliant. I fucking love that game. It's got some amazing writing in it, particularly the melancholic short stories recounting the many lives of its immortal protagonist. Its gameplay is rock-solid turn-based combat with an interesting immortality dynamic and a neat little time-based attack gimmick. And via the character of Jansen, Lost Odyssey still has by far some of the best and funniest voice acting of any damn game.
Okay, not funny. I'm not laughing, okay?
But it was released in 2008. The tail end of the 2000s, around the time the term JRPG is said to have been embraced on a wide scale, and, as Yoshida tells it, used or at least seen derisively. And indeed, this was around the time such games were lambasted for being old-fashioned, boring, all the same, in need of a shake-up. I saw this brilliant game criticised time and time again for these things, and I just didn't get it. It was doing what games of its genre did, and it did those things fantastically. I believe it's no coincidence that Square Enix spent years after Final Fantasy IX ceaselessly reinventing the wheel with its combat mechanics and gameplay gimmicks. It is just a belief, mind. But for years I said Square gave off the impression that it was ashamed of the genre that made its flagship series so famous. But I can hardly blame them if they listened at all to Western game reviews, who seemed at the time to have well and truly turned on the genre. The early 2010s saw anti-Japanese game sentiment really start to brew. I was reminded of what game developers Phil Fish and Jonathan Blow were saying of Japan's games around this time in an article by VG247. Now, my memory sucks, but after being jolted, it's all clear as day now. This was like a big deal back then. Your games just suck, Fish said to a Japanese developer at a GDC panel before offering on Twitter, "Your country's games are fucking terrible nowadays."
Is it what is about Japanese games that inspired us?
Recent.
Recent
I'm sorry.
They suck. I'm sorry. Like, you guys need to get with the times and make better interfaces and like update your technology. We're totally kicking your ass. Back then, you guys were the king of the world, but your time has passed. I'm so sorry.
Did you look at his face? Look at what you did, Phil.
I have a more specific.
Meanwhile, Blow would call Japanese games joyless husks. And no, he wasn't describing himself. Okay, that was a bit of a low blow. Ha! But he's pretty joyless.
This is, well, I mean, I don't like Japanese games either. The thing that I don't like about them, all the modern ones that I've played, except, you know, like Dark Souls and Demon Souls and stuff, is you sit down and the game treats you like an idiot, right?
Fish has since apologised, but his comments reflected wider attitudes in the gaming community at the time. This was a period where, on forums and social media, JRPG was absolutely a term of derision. I've always loved a good game in the vein of Final Fantasy, as evidenced with my long-standing grudge against critics of Lost Odyssey's alleged tiredness. But hell, I still stereotype the genre as one dominated by silliness and quote-unquote femboy characters with pointy hair. As has been pointed out during all this discourse, a particular quote from BioWare's Greg Zeschuk in 2009 is a perfect snapshot of many attitudes toward Japan's RPG output at the time. JRPGs are in dire straits due to the lack of evolution or progress. And that was someone from BioWare who said that. Now, it's been debated that JRPG started as a neutral term and became tarnished in the late 2000s as a result of shifting attitudes, but whenever it happened, this is seemingly around the time Japan picked up on it and took it as an insult. And why wouldn't they? It's been said that the last quote in particular started discourse that reached enough of a peak to affect attitudes in the Japanese game industry. In any case, the term has stung for at least some Japanese developers, certainly enough for Yoshida to consider commenting on it. Speaking of which, he had more to say, adding a timeline that seems to be backed up by the history we've been discussing. I remember seeing something 15 years ago, which was basically a definition of what a JRPG was versus a Western RPG, and it's kind of like Final Fantasy VII, and it has this type of graphics, this length of story, and compartmentalizing what we were creating into a JRPG box. And taking offense to that because that's not how we're going into creating. We were going into creating an RPG, but to be compartmentalized, they felt was discriminatory. For a long time, we've broken role-playing games into two distinct, one may say reductive, camps: JRPG and Western RPG. The first is almost always turn-based, text-heavy, linear, traditional, and all weird and anime-flavoured because Japan. The second is Skyrim. Those are your two camps. It's interesting to note how one term isolates a single country, while another refers to an entire half of the globe, indicating the long-running stereotype that Japan is uniquely weird and should be singled out while everywhere else is quote-unquote normal enough to be grouped together. It's also important to note that while JRPG has remained in use, Western RPG barely comes up as a term anymore, replaced by the term Action RPG. While more accurate, its use in relation to its sister term only further highlights the singling out of Japan. You can see how utterly fucked up this disparate terminology gets when categorizing a game like Dark Souls. See, Dark Souls is undoubtedly an action RPG. It has what we call RPG elements in abundance, and it's action-oriented, with real-time combat that the game very much focuses on. It's an action RPG. It's also a JRPG. I mean, by sheer literal use of the term, it's an RPG from Japan. It's a Japanese role-playing game. Or I guess a Japanese action role-playing game. A JRPG. People have arguments about this too, whether or not it's a JRPG. And it's because JRPG, to a lot of people, means something very distinct. But we need to remember one key point when we on this side of the world argue what a JRPG is and isn't. In Japan, they just call them RPGs, because whether it's Dark Souls or Final Fantasy, that's all they really are, and the differences between those RPGs aren't really exclusive to one country. Are we going to call Stick of Truth a JRPG? Indeed, this is something Yoshida's translator outright communicated during the interview. One thing he wants to get across, said Fox, is that when we create games, we don't go into them thinking we are creating JRPGs, we are just creating RPGs. The term JRPG is used by Western media rather than users and media in Japan. While we've been looking stuff up for this topic, my partner stumbled on an interesting comment. Someone mentioned, there was a whole thing like a month or two ago where people were screaming mad saying Pokemon was not a JRPG. I missed that debate, but that sounds incredible. Cause think about that. For the jizz-peddling love of it all, just think about the implication of the assertion that Pokemon isn't a JRPG. Of all things. And as I say this, I gotta confess that until now, I never really considered whether or not it was a JRPG. It was just Pokemon. But it has all the hallmarks of what has become associated with the label, right? Turn-based combat, text-heavy, fairly linear, traditional, and it is very weird and so anime-flavoured it was literally introduced to many kids via a fucking anime. So why would anybody argue that Pokemon isn't a JRPG? Well, think about it. Pokemon is more than just any old video game. It's a worldwide smash hit. It's about as pop culture as games can get, having become one of the biggest cross-media franchises since the late 90s. Crucially, you see, this series is not niche. As weird as a game about children wandering into the woods on their own to collect electric mice and psychic clown boys is, it's so well known that we're all used to it. Pokemon is mainstream. Pokemon is normal. And that's the difference maker. It's an RPG. It's Japanese. It's unique and odd, and all the things, positive and negative, we associate with JRPGs. But it's so famous, so cross-cultural, it's become thoroughly normalized, and it feeds the attitude that Japan and normal are mutually exclusive ideas. Now, if we wanted to get political, we could point out the hint of cultural appropriation that simmers beneath the surface of these attitudes. Final Fantasy is a JRPG, it's popular, but it's still niche in the wider world of pop culture, and it could still be classified as anime silliness. Pokemon, though, is everybody's. Dark Souls is comparable to a Western RPG, not those wacky games about pretty boys with anime hair. Oh, prompto. I've been doing a little reading on colonialism, and there are certainly some reflective attitudes in the divvying up of games made in Japan as specifically Japanese and specifically not. But of course, that's only if we want to get political with it. Bad girl. In fairness, of course, there is a world of difference between, say, Bloodborne and Final Fantasy IX, my best one from Final Fantasies. Both are RPGs, both play completely differently. There should indeed be differentiating terminology to separate the two. We've already got action RPG for the former, that's done and dusted, though I also put Bloodborne in the survival horror camp, but I wanted to say something that wasn't Dark Souls. But anyway, what about FF9? Turn-based RPG? Narrative or character-driven RPG? Or is JRPG fine, despite the negative, even hateful connotations that were not only historically applied to the term, but have had repercussions in Japan so heavy they still affect developers today? In the West, games typically labelled JRPG are no longer treated with such universal derision, as such games have become accepted again, and ones released during that period of anti-Japanese game sentiment have often been historically vindicated. Lost Odyssey, for example, is a game I feel gets treated a lot more kindly today than back when it was first new.
Thanks. A little late, though.
Which reminds me, I started replaying it a few months ago and didn't get far. I ought to fire up the Xbox and get back to it because, and I don't know if I've been subtle enough about this, the game is fucking brilliant. I've been on a so-called JRPG kick lately, mostly due to my aforementioned obsession with theatre rhythm. I used to play such games all the time and then fell off, and I had a reason for that. For the longest time I used to say I've fallen out of playing JRPGs because I didn't have time for such big 80-hour experiences. But I'd say that while putting in excess of 80 hours into all sorts of other games that weren't those, and I've literally just now realised that the old prejudices have stuck with me for a long time. In any case, I've been double fisting both FFs 8 and 9, and I need to get back to a Western game developed with intense old school Squaresoft sensibilities, Chained Echoes. And there's a thought. Do we call Chained Echoes a JRPG or not? It literally lifts a ton of mechanical and stylistic stuff from Chrono Trigger. It's got all the hallmarks of what we call JRPG, except of course, for the fact it ain't Japanese. And I think that highlights the logistic issue of labelling an entire genre by country. If we take out the emotional aspect, we still have to contend with the fact that if we insist on using JRPG as a term based on gameplay tropes, we're calling Undertale a Japanese RPG. And maybe you're fine with that. It's weird though. I got off the main point, which is that today JRPG isn't a general term of derision anymore. Does that make it okay to use? Depends. Is it still harmful? According to Yoshida, it's at the very least uncomfortable. In fact, the Skill Up interview notes that he was visibly uncomfortable when the term came up. For my part, I'm thinking maybe it's a term worth retiring, at least on a personal basis. Maybe? I don't know. I'm a British American. I've got two cultural backgrounds, and they're based entirely on having no culture of their own, so I don't know what's a good idea. But I do think this is all worth considering. I'd have no issue if we retired the term, and I'm up for giving it a go. Turn-based RPG sounds good, although I do like character-driven or just character RPG. It certainly makes for a big differentiator between playing an unnamed character class versus playing Cloud Strife. Just so long as we keep putting respect on Lost Odyssey's name though, I think it'll be alright. Christ almighty. That's taking care of that for a week or so.
Now, I'm not going to pretend that culture isn't different in different countries and that culture doesn't inform our media. Of course, differing culture informs that culture's media. Call of Duty, for example, is a very American game. If I were to, say, criticize a trope in Japanese game design, I'd say endless text-based tutorials. That's something I find kind of unique to Japanese game design, where even 5 hours into a game it'll pause and give you a text box telling you how to, engage with some sort of likely interesting but laboriously explained system. Talking of like games with different flavours in other locations, Eurojank is a term used to describe certain European games of a mid-tier flavour, often published by Focus Home Interactive. What else? We've got like Eastern European games have their own very particular flavour. And you look at the old Commodore 64 games, I'm not old! From back in the day, especially in Britain, which was typified by a lot of bedroom programmers with a very unique, very British sense of humour. Those are all worth considering as well, but I think the main takeaway is that we don't repeat the mistakes of 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I'm not old! I am. But we don't repeat those mistakes and start slagging off an entire country's games because there are good Japanese games, there are bad Japanese games, there are good American games, and then there's everything Ubisoft puts out. So that's something to consider, but I will leave you with one final thought, one final thing to mull over, and that is that you all should thank God for me. Victory.